Hey there, you're looking kind of cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out all my other socials. Enjoy. The bottle of aspirin seemed to mock her from its perch on the top shelf of the medicine cabinet. Sandra's fingers grazed the cool plastic as she stretched, cursing her short stature. With a sigh, she dragged over the step stool from the corner of the bathroom. As she climbed up, her gaze landed on an unfamiliar orange prescription bottle tucked behind some Band-Aids. Curiosity piqued, she reached for it, squinting at the label. Her brow furrowed as she read the unfamiliar drug name. Estradiol. Sandra's mind raced. Who did these belong to? Her husband, Mark, didn't take any regular medications. And Tyler? Well, he was a healthy 21-year-old. What would he need hormone pills for? A sick feeling settled in her stomach as pieces started to click into place. The way Tyler had become so secretive lately. How he'd grown out his hair and started wearing baggier clothes. The hushed phone conversations she sometimes overheard. No. It couldn't be. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thoughts. There had to be some other explanation. But as she turned the bottle over in her hand, seeing Tyler's name printed clearly on the label, denial became impossible. Her son was taking estrogen. Her son was... Sandra sank down onto the closed toilet lid, her legs suddenly weak. The aspirin lay forgotten on the shelf above as she stared at the innocent-looking pills that had just shattered her world. How long had this been going on? How could she not have noticed? What kind of mother was she? Anger and hurt bubbled up inside her. Why hadn't Tyler talked to her about this? Did he not trust her? After everything she and Mark had done for him, all the sacrifices they'd made, she stormed out of the bathroom, prescription bottle clutched tightly in her fist. "Tyler!" she shouted, marching down the hallway to his room. "Tyler, get out here right now!" The door creaked open and Tyler's head poked out, hair falling in his eyes. "Mom? What's wrong?" Sandra thrust the bottle in his face. "What is this? And don't you dare lie to me!" All the color drained from Tyler's face as his eyes locked onto the pills. Where did you find those?" "Never mind where I found them. What are you doing with estrogen pills? Are you..." She couldn't bring herself to say the words. Tyler's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Can we talk about this inside?" he asked quietly, glancing nervously down the hall. Sandra pushed past him into the bedroom, pacing as Tyler shut the door behind them. Clothes were strewn across the floor and posters of androgynous pop stars covered the walls. How had she not seen the signs? "Explain," she demanded, crossing her arms. "Now." Tyler perched on the edge of his bed, hands fidgeting in his lap. I've been wanting to tell you and Dad for a while now. I just didn't know how." He took a deep breath. "Mom, I'm transgender. I'm a woman, or I guess I should say, I've always been a woman, just in the wrong body." The words hit Sandra like a physical blow. She sank into Tyler's desk chair, mind reeling. "But how? When? You never showed any signs as a child. You were such a normal little boy." Tyler winced. "I hid it really well. I knew it wasn't normal. I was scared of how you and Dad would react. But I've felt this way for as long as I can remember. Being a boy always felt like wearing a costume that didn't fit right." Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes. "Why didn't you tell us sooner? We could have gotten you help, found someone for you to talk to." "Because I was terrified you'd react exactly like this," Tyler said quietly. "That you'd think something was wrong with me, that I needed to be fixed." "Of course something's wrong," Sandra exclaimed. "This isn't natural, Tyler. It's not how God made you." Tyler flinched as if he'd been slapped. "I didn't choose this, Mom. Do you think I wanted to feel wrong in my own skin, to hate looking in the mirror, to be scared every day that someone would find out my secret and hurt me for it?" Guilt tugged at Sandra's heart, but she pushed it aside. "So you've just been lying to us all this time? Sneaking around behind our backs, taking these pills? Do you have any idea how dangerous that could be?" "I didn't start the hormones until I talked to a doctor," Tyler protested. "I've been seeing a therapist for over a year. They made sure I was ready for this step." Sandra's eyes widened. "A year? You've been keeping this from us for that long?" Tyler nodded. Miserably. "I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you. I really did. I was scared of losing you." The anger drained out of Sandra, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. She buried her face in her hands. "I don't understand any of this. How can you think you're a woman when you were born a man? It doesn't make sense." "I know it's confusing," Tyler said gently. "I'm still figuring a lot of it out myself, but I know who I am inside. I've always known, even if I didn't have the words for it." He hesitated, then added softly, "And I go by Brielle now. That's the name I've chosen for myself." Sandra's head snapped up. "Brielle? You're changing your name too?" It felt like the final nail in the coffin of the son she thought she knew. Tyler? No, Brielle? Nodded. "It feels right. Like it's always been my name, I just didn't know it." Silence fell between them, heavy and oppressive. Sandra stared at the person across from her, trying to reconcile the image of her little boy with this stranger who called herself Brielle. "I need some time," she said finally, standing up. "This is a lot to process." Brielle's face fell, but she nodded. "I understand. Just, please don't tell Dad yet. I want to be the one to tell him." Sandra paused at the door, one hand on the knob. "I won't say anything, but you need to tell him soon. He deserves to know." As she left the room, she heard a muffled sob behind her. Every instinct screamed at her to go back, to comfort her child, but she couldn't. Not right now. She needed space to think, to grieve, to try to understand. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and awkward silences. Sandra went through the motions of her daily routine, mind constantly churning over her conversation with Brielle. She found herself poring over old photo albums, searching for any hint she might have missed. There was Tyler at 5, proudly showing off a gap-toothed grin and Superman pajamas. At 10, covered in mud after a Little League game. At 16, slouching in an ill-fitting suit for prom pictures. Had there been signs all along that she'd been blind to? Or had this come out of nowhere, some phase or confusion brought on by too much time on the internet? She wanted so badly to talk to someone, to seek advice or comfort. But who could she turn to? Her friends at church? They'd be horrified, tell her to pray it away, or send Tyler to conversion therapy. Her own parents? They were getting on in years, set in their ways. This would break their hearts. For the first time in her life, Sandra felt truly alone. Brielle, for her part, seemed to be walking on eggshells. She kept to her room most of the time, only emerging for meals or to use the bathroom. When their paths did cross, conversations were stilted and brief. It wasn't until nearly a week had passed that Sandra found the courage to breach the subject again. She knocked softly on Brielle's door one evening, heart pounding. "Come in," came the muffled reply. Sandra stepped inside, taking in the room with new eyes. She noticed things she'd overlooked before: the pastel throw pillows on the bed, the collection of scented lotions on the dresser, the delicate dream catcher hanging in the window. Brielle sat cross-legged on the bed, laptop balanced on her knees. She looked up warily as Sandra entered. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" Sandra perched awkwardly on the edge of the bed. "I thought maybe we could talk some more, if you're up for it." Hope flickered in Brielle's eyes. "Yeah, of course." She set the laptop aside and turned to face her mother. "I've been doing some reading," Sandra began hesitantly, "trying to understand all of this. I still have a lot of questions, but I want you to know that I'm trying." Brielle's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That means a lot, Mom, thank you. What do you want to know?" Sandra took a deep breath. "Well, for starters, how long have you known that you were transgender?" "On some level, probably my whole life," Brielle said. "But I didn't have the words for it until I was maybe 14 or 15. That's when I started researching online and realizing there was a name for what I was feeling." Sandra nodded slowly. And the hormones? How long have you been taking them? About 6 months, Brielle admitted. I started seeing a gender therapist last year, and she referred me to an endocrinologist after a few months. They did a lot of tests and made sure I understood all the risks before prescribing anything. What kind of risks? Sandra asked, brow furrowing with concern. Brielle launched into an explanation of the potential side effects and long-term implications of hormone therapy. Sandra was surprised by how knowledgeable she sounded. It was clear she'd done her research. As Brielle spoke, Sandra found herself studying her child's face. The features were the same ones she'd known and loved for 21 years, and yet there was something different. A softness to the jaw, perhaps? A glow to the skin? Or maybe it was simply the way Brielle's eyes lit up as she talked, more animated than Sandra had seen in years. And of course, there's the risk of infertility, Brielle was saying. But I've never really wanted biological kids anyway, so that doesn't bother me as much. Sandra's heart clenched. You don't want children? Brielle shrugged. Maybe someday, but if I do, I'd want to adopt. There are already so many kids out there who need homes. It was such a compassionate, mature response. Sandra felt a surge of pride, quickly followed by guilt. She'd been so focused on her own feelings, she hadn't stopped to consider how difficult this must be for Brielle. I'm sorry, she said softly, for how I reacted when I found out. I was shocked and scared, but that's no excuse. You deserved better. Tears welled up in Brielle's eyes. It's okay, Mom. I know it's a lot to take in. I'm just glad you're willing to listen now. Sandra reached out and squeezed her hand. I love you, no matter what. I hope you know that. Brielle's lower lip trembled. Even if I'm not the son you thought you had? You're my child, Sandra said firmly. Nothing will ever change that. It might take me some time to adjust, but I'm going to do my best, I promise. With a choked sob, Brielle threw herself into Sandra's arms. They clung to each other, years of unspoken fears and doubts pouring out in a flood of tears. When they finally pulled apart, both wiping at damp cheeks, Sandra asked hesitantly, So, Brielle, where did that name come from? A shy smile tugged at Brielle's lips. I've always loved it. It means God is my strength in Hebrew. I thought that was fitting, since my faith has been such a big part of helping me accept myself. Sandra blinked in surprise. You still believe in God, even with everything? Brielle nodded. More than ever, I believe God made me this way for a reason, that my journey is part of His plan, even if I don't understand it all yet. It was a perspective Sandra hadn't considered. She'd been so caught up in her own rigid interpretations of Scripture, she'd forgotten that faith could be a source of comfort and strength for Brielle, too. I'd like to hear more about that sometime, she said, if you're willing to share. Brielle's face lit up. I'd love that, Mom. As the conversation continued, Sandra felt some of the weight lift from her shoulders. There was still so much to figure out. Telling Mark, dealing with extended family and their church community, navigating the practicalities of Brielle's transition. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that they could face it together. The next morning, Sandra woke early and slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Mark. She padded down to the kitchen, lost in thought. As she waited for the coffee to brew, her gaze fell on the collection of family photos lining the wall. There was Tyler, Brielle, through the years, each frozen moment a reminder of the child she thought she knew. With a pang, she realized there were no recent photos. When was the last time they'd taken a family picture? Brielle had always been camera shy the past few years, ducking out of frame or hiding behind others. Now, Sandra understood why. The coffee maker beeped, jolting her from her reverie. As she poured a cup, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Brielle appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep. Morning, Sandra said, offering a small smile. Coffee? Brielle nodded gratefully. Please. As Sandra fixed a second mug, she studied her child out of the corner of her eye. Brielle wore an oversized t-shirt and pajama pants, but there was something undeniably feminine in the way she moved, the tilt of her head. Had it always been there, and Sandra just hadn't seen it? Or was this new, a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis? They sat at the kitchen table, sipping their coffee in companionable silence. Finally, Sandra spoke. I was thinking, maybe we could go shopping this weekend? Get you some new clothes? Brielle's eyes widened. Really? You'd do that? Sandra nodded. I want to support you, sweetheart, and I know your wardrobe probably isn't what you'd like it to be right now. A brilliant smile broke across Brielle's face. That would be amazing, Mom. Thank you. As they chatted about styles and stores, Sandra felt a warmth bloom in her chest. This was new territory for both of them, but they were navigating it together. The rest of the week passed in a whirlwind of tentative conversations and small, meaningful gestures. Sandra found herself paying closer attention to the little things. The way Brielle's eyes lit up when she used her chosen name, how she seemed to stand a little taller each day. There were still moments of discomfort and confusion. Sandra caught herself using the wrong pronouns more than once, wincing at Brielle's carefully hidden hurt, and the looming specter of telling Mark hung over them both. But there were beautiful moments too, like when Sandra came home from work to find Brielle had cooked dinner, her favorite lasagna recipe, or the night they stayed up late watching old home movies, laughing and crying together at the memories. Finally, Saturday arrived. As they climbed into the car for their shopping trip, Sandra felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was a big step, a public acknowledgement of Brielle's identity. Where to first? She asked as they pulled out of the driveway. Brielle fidgeted with the hem of her baggy sweatshirt. Maybe the mall? They have a lot of different stores we could try. Sandra nodded, and they set off. The drive was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they walked into the bustling mall, Sandra noticed Brielle hunching her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller. Hey, she said gently, squeezing her hand. It's okay, you have nothing to be ashamed of. Brielle gave a shaky smile. Thanks, Mom. They started with a few mainstream stores, browsing racks of colorful blouses and flowy skirts. Sandra watched as Brielle ran her fingers over soft fabrics, a look of longing in her eyes. See anything you like? She prompted. Brielle hesitated, then pulled out a pretty floral sundress. Maybe this. I've always wanted to try one, but... It's beautiful, Sandra said warmly. Why don't you try it on? As Brielle disappeared into the fitting room, Sandra found herself blinking back tears. She thought of all the shopping trips they'd taken over the years, how Brielle had always seemed so uncomfortable, rushing through the process. Now she understood why. When Brielle emerged, Sandra's breath caught in her throat. The dress fit perfectly, accentuating curves she hadn't noticed before, but it was the radiant smile on Brielle's face that truly took her breath away. Oh, sweetheart, she breathed. You look gorgeous. Brielle twirled, the skirt flaring out around her. Really? You think so? Sandra nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd been so worried about losing her child. She hadn't considered what she might gain. This confident, joyful young woman standing before her. They spent the next few hours moving from store to store, slowly building a new wardrobe. Blouses and skirts, a few pairs of well-fitting jeans, some delicate jewelry. Sandra insisted on a practical blazer for job interviews, while Brielle splurged on a pair of strappy sandals. As they shopped, Sandra found herself relaxing. The stares of other shoppers, which had made her tense at first, faded into the background. All that mattered was the growing bond between her and Brielle. Their final stop was a lingerie store. Sandra hesitated outside, but Brielle tugged her hand. Please, Mom, I need some... things? Pushing aside her discomfort, Sandra followed her in. They navigated the racks of lacy bras and silky nightgowns, Brielle's cheeks pink with embarrassment. Can I help you find anything? A saleswoman approached with a friendly smile. Before Sandra could speak, Brielle squared her shoulders. Yes, please, I'm transgender and just starting my transition. I could use some advice on what might work best for me. Sandra's heart swelled with pride at her daughter's courage. The saleswoman's smile never wavered. Of course, Let's start with some bralettes, and we can go from there. As they left the mall hours later, arms laden with bags, Sandra felt a sense of peace settle over her. There was still a long road ahead, but they'd taken an important step today. "Thank you," Brielle said softly as they loaded the car. "For everything. I know this isn't easy for you." Sandra pulled her into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, Brielle, and I'm grateful you're letting me be part of your journey." As they drove home, the sun setting in a blaze of pink and gold, Sandra glanced over at Brielle. She was looking out the window, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time in years, she looked truly content. Sandra sent up a silent prayer of thanks. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. Her child was happier than she'd ever seen her. And in the end, wasn't that what every parent wanted? The next challenge loomed on the horizon, telling Mark. But as Sandra reached over and squeezed Brielle's hand, she knew they would face it together. As a family. When they pulled into the driveway, Brielle's smile faltered. "Do you think Dad's home yet?" Sandra checked her watch. Probably. His shift should have ended an hour ago. Brielle nodded, chewing her lower lip. "I guess it's time then." "Only if you're ready," Sandra reassured her. "We can wait if you need more time." Brielle took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "No, I want to do this. He deserves to know." They gathered the shopping bags and headed inside. The smell of pizza greeted them, Mark's go-to dinner when left to his own devices. "That you, hun?" Mark called from the living room. "How was the shopping trip?" Sandra and Brielle exchanged a look. "It was good," Sandra called back. "We need to talk to you about something, though. Can you come to the kitchen?" There was a pause, then the sound of Mark hauling himself out of his recliner. He appeared in the doorway, brow furrowed with concern. "Everything okay?" Brielle clutched one of the shopping bags tightly, knuckles white. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you." Mark's gaze flicked between them, sensing the tension. "What's going on? You two look like somebody died." "Nobody died," Sandra said gently. "But there have been some changes. Why don't we sit down?" They gathered around the kitchen table, an echo of countless family dinners. But this time, the air was thick with unspoken words and nervous energy. Brielle stared down at her hands, unable to meet her father's eyes. "Dad, I'm transgender. I'm a woman. I've known for a long time, but I've been too scared to tell you." The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra watched emotions flicker across Mark's face. Confusion, disbelief, anger, hurt. "Is this some kind of joke?" he finally said, voice tight. Brielle shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, Dad, it's who I am, who I've always been, even if I didn't have the words for it before." Mark turned to Sandra, betrayal etched in the lines of his face. "Did you know about this?" "I only found out recently," she said softly. "I've been trying to understand and support Brielle." "Brielle?" Mark interrupted. "Who the hell is Brielle?" That's my name now," Brielle said, voice barely above a whisper. "The name I've chosen for myself." Mark pushed back from the table, chair scraping against the linoleum. "This is insane. You're my son, my boy. I don't know where all this nonsense is coming from, but it stops now." "Mark," Sandra said sharply, "sit down and listen. This isn't easy for any of us, but Brielle needs our support." "Support?" Mark scoffed. "You want me to support my son throwing away everything we've raised him to be? To play along with some delusion?" Brielle flinched, as if she'd been struck. "It's not a delusion, Dad. This is who I am, who I've always been." Mark shook his head, pacing the small kitchen. "No, I won't accept this. You need help, Tyler. Real help, not people encouraging this sickness." "The only thing making me sick is hiding who I really am," Brielle said, a spark of defiance in her tear-filled eyes. "I've talked to doctors, therapists. This isn't a phase or a mistake. It's who I am." Mark turned to Sandra, desperation in his voice. "You can't be okay with this. Our son, our daughter," Sandra corrected gently. I know it's a shock, Mark. I'm still processing it too. But Brielle needs us now more than ever. For a moment, it looked like Mark might argue further. Then his shoulders slumped, the fight going out of him. I need some air, he muttered, heading for the back door. Dad, please, Brielle called after him, but the door slammed shut, leaving them in stunned silence. Sandra moved to pull Brielle into a hug, murmuring soothing words as she sobbed against her shoulder. Over the top of Brielle's head, she watched Mark through the kitchen window. He paced the backyard, hands clenched at his sides. This wasn't going to be an easy road, but as she held her daughter close, Sandra silently vowed to do whatever it took to keep their family together. The days that followed were tense and uncomfortable. Mark retreated into stony silence, barely acknowledging Brielle's presence. He threw himself into work, picking up extra shifts and coming home late. Brielle, for her part, seemed to shrink in on herself. The confidence she'd shown during their shopping trip faded, replaced by hunched shoulders and averted eyes. She spent most of her time in her room, emerging only for meals or when Sandra coaxed her out. Sandra found herself caught in the middle, trying to bridge the gulf between her husband and daughter. She left pamphlets about transgender issues on Mark's nightstand, sent him links to support groups for parents. Most went unread, but she refused to give up hope. One evening, about a week after their confrontation in the kitchen, Sandra cornered Mark in the garage. He was tinkering with his old motorcycle, a project he'd neglected for months. "We need to talk," she said firmly, crossing her arms. Mark didn't look up from the engine. "About what?" "You know what. About Brielle. About our family." He tensed at the name, but didn't argue. Progress, of a sort. Sandra perched on a nearby workbench. "I know this is hard for you. It's been hard for me, too. But we can't keep going on like this. Brielle needs us." Mark's hand stilled on the wrench he was holding. "I don't know how to do this, Sandra. How to look at my son and see... someone else." "She's not someone else," Sandra said gently. "She's still our child. The same person we've loved for 21 years. She's just finally able to be her true self." Mark shook his head. "I don't understand any of this. How can someone just decide they're not the gender they were born as?" "It's not a decision," Sandra explained patiently. "From everything I've read, from what Brielle has told me, this is something she's felt her whole life. She just didn't have the words for it before." She reached out, laying a hand on Mark's arm. "I know it's confusing. I'm still learning too. But the most important thing is that Brielle is happier now. Doesn't that count for something?" Mark was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the grease-stained concrete. Finally, he spoke, voice rough with emotion. "I'm scared, Sandra. What if we're making a mistake? What if this is just a phase and we're encouraging it?" Sandra's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "Oh, honey, I've had those same fears. But you haven't seen Brielle these past few weeks. The way she lights up when we use her new name, how much more confident she is in herself." She squeezed his hand. "This isn't a phase. This is our child finally being able to be herself." Mark looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be the father of a daughter." "You already are," Sandra said softly. "You just need to open your heart and see her." They talked for hours that night, Mark finally letting out all the fears and doubts he'd been bottling up. Sandra listened, offering reassurance where she could and admitting her own struggles. By the time they went to bed, exhausted but lighter, they had a plan. It wouldn't be easy, but they were committed to trying. For Brielle's sake and for their family. Brielle's journey did not always go smoothly. As her body underwent changes from hormone therapy, she experienced a mix of excitement and discomfort. Thanks for watching. The rest won't be viewable on YouTube, so check out Patreon if you want more. I hope you have a wonderful day, my cutie.